So welcome to this, the first in a series of three. So next Sunday and the following Sunday, we also will have speakers with us. This morning, it is my pleasure and again an honor to welcome Dr. Sam Roberts. I did not go to Tennessee Wesleyan, but you know, he's never held that against me, and he has treated me just as if I had been one of his students, and even invited me to Tennessee Wesleyan lunches at annual conference. And I've reminded him I did not go to Tennessee Wesleyan, but thank you. I will happily go eat barbecue with all of the alumni from Tennessee Wesleyan. And so his hospitality, I think, will show through in his presentation this morning. Dr. Roberts is from wild and wonderful West Virginia, of which he is very proud and continues to go back and participate in the cultural life of West Virginia.
Such as it is.
Such as it is. He taught at Tennessee Wesleyan from 1986 until 2012, and where he retired. And although you know, I joke about not having attended Tennessee Wesleyan, so many of our clergy in this and lay people in this conference have been shaped by his friendship and by his training and education. And so our conference is deeply indebted to his willingness to share his gifts in this place. And so I am so thankful that he's agreed to join us this morning to present our first in our summer lecture series. Dr. Roberts, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope he didn't ask you folks on that education committee to raise your hands so he can share the guilt. I'm glad to be here. I'm privileged and honored to be here. I'd first note that this is basically an effort to convey what I've found to be at least a semblance of religious truth. That's truth for me, not the religious truth. I think too many folks these days pretend to have the religious truth, and I simply don't think that's possible. At least not on this side of the veil. So with that in mind, as Tim noted, I grew up in West Virginia, specifically in the southern West Virginia coalfields in Sophia. I left Sophia at age 18 to attend West Virginia Wesleyan College in Buchanan. And like most all of my peers from that area, I just assumed that everyone believed in God. Because in my limited experience, everyone did. In fact, the summer before I left for college, a district superintendent had preached at my church, and with reference to the classical arguments for the existence of God, he proved it. Or thought he did. And then I went to college, and I learned you cannot rationally prove the existence of God. I learned you cannot pass off an inadequate proof as objective truth for science. The fellow who put me on track faith-wise at West Virginia Wesleyan was a philosophy professor named Al Black, and ironically, an agnostic. Unable to accept the claims of theism, but unable to satisfactorily dismiss them either, and embrace atheism, because as he taught us, it's as hard to prove the latter as it is to prove the former. The agnostic says, wait and see. Let's wait until there's more evidence, one way or the other, and then decide. That's a legitimate and honorable approach, intellectually honest, and as I've encountered it at least, morally responsible. But it doesn't mesh very well with the kind of misguided and presumptuous theism that I took to college. My roommate, Ellis Conley, himself a retired pastor from the West Virginia Annual Conference, caught on to Dr. Black before I did. we were taking his ethics class together, and Ellis noticed early on that Dr. Black attacked every ethical theory that relied on God for its motivation. So Ellis started wondering if Dr. Black believed in God. Roberts, he said, I don't think Dr. Black believes in God. Sure he does, I said. Everybody believes in God. Well, said Ellis, why does he say the things he says? Why is he constantly attacking God? And I had this theory. Dr. Black, I argued, knew that most of us were pre-ministerial students. And he knew about the many different views and opinions we were going to have to confront once we entered God's fields of service. So he was preparing us. He was equipping us to deal with the doubt and skepticism we would inevitably face as clergy. And then before the end of the class, he'd give us the answers. That's what I thought. But Ellis thought that was horse hockey. Well, eventually somebody in the class had the temerity to ask Dr. Black about God. Dr. Black, she said, you do believe in God, don't you? He looked aghast. Well, no, he said. He thought he made that clear. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said he'd rather believe in a little green man who lived in a tree and made Keebler cookies, because at least he'd seen him on TV. We then decided that we needed to save Dr. Black's soul. So we'd lie in wait for him at the student center when he'd come for coffee, and especially at the tennis courts where he'd show up, usually in the late afternoon, looking for a match. We'd play what, at that time, we called odd man. 2 on one side of the net, 1 on the other side of the net. And if you found yourself on the side of the net with Dr. Black, your primary responsibility was not to play tennis, it was to witness to Dr. Black. He was a patient man, he was a good sport, and a better agnostic than he was a tennis player. The closest we ever got to a successful rebuttal of his agnosticism, I believe, was back in the classroom, when one day Ellis, again, asked him, Dr. Black, are you married? Yes, he said, to Mrs. Black. Do you love Mrs. Black? Ellis asked. Yes, Dr. Black replied. Does Mrs. Black love you? Ellis asked. Yes, Dr. Black said again. How do you know? And Dr. Black recited a list typical of that place and time. He said, she cooks my meals, she washes and irons my clothes, she keeps my house, she provides me with stimulating conversation, and he said, she does some other things for me, Ellis, that I'm not at liberty to discuss with you. Oh, Dr. Black, Ellis said, she might just be out to get your money. Then a light bulb went off in my head. Ellis had made a crucial point, and Dr. Black was a believer. Ellis had demonstrated that love, like faith, is not objective, it's not self-evident, it's not independent of the knower, it cannot be proved. It's not amenable to the scientific method, it's subjective, personal, and dependent on the knower. As my old Yale philosophy professor, Paul Homer, used to say, it has to do with the emotions, passions, and feelings. Realizing that even Dr. Black put faith in something was a significant event for me. In line with, but also a step beyond my realizing the distinction between faith and reason that I'd learned from him earlier. And then I began to explore the legitimacy of that faith element of life. Now, it's true, I know, that Dr. Black's faith in his wife's affection, with a small f, let's say, was a far cry from faith in God with a capital F. But it opened up possibilities that before I feared were gone. And those possibilities were intriguing, because what I came to see then was the prospect of a different way of knowing God. A different way of knowing God than I had considered before. I was now seeing not only the distinction between faith and reason, that famed Cartesian split, I was beginning to understand the true nature of faith in the wake of it. The relationship of faith to reason and the nature of faith have occupied me in one way or another ever since. Robert McAfee Brown put this relationship in a way I found helpful, and he did this decades ago. And in so doing, I think he provides a gateway for, if not reconciling faith and reason, then holding the two in proper juxtaposition. Several hundred years ago, scientists began to point out that the world had taken millions, perhaps billions of years to evolve. The staunch believers in the Bible said that was blasphemy. Didn't the Bible say that God created the world in 6 days? Nobody was going to tell them that each of those 6 days equaled about 1,000,000 years or so. Who was right? The religionists or the scientists? To ask that question in that way, as we often do, is to miss the point. Let us ask rather what these creation stories are trying to say and what they're not trying to say. First and foremost, they're stories praising God. A God so great that God has created the universe. They're dealing with religious questions, and specifically the religious question, why? Why the world? Because God in God's greatness and love has brought it into being. Now, in making that religious point, the authors also say something of how God did all this. And it's here that science raises appropriate and proper questions. For science investigates answers to that question, how? The authors of the creation stories quite naturally base their stories on the scientific information available to them around 500 BC or earlier. The fact that our scientific knowledge has changed considerably since then doesn't necessarily undercut or disprove the religious insights of the authors. I'm not sure there's a real conflict in believing the scientific accuracy of modern evolution and at the same time believing in the religious accuracy of the Genesis stories. It's only when you confuse the two that you have problems. So let's make sure we understand that when we're dealing with religious questions and scientific questions, we're dealing with two different ways of describing reality, and they need not be confused. Science has every right to ask that question, how? And religion, why? Here are 4 statements. 2 + 2 = 4. I love you. Babe Ruth hit 714 home runs in his major league career. I love you too. Statements 1 and 3 are of a different nature or order from statements 2 and 4. 1 and 3 are factually verifiable. You can look them up. Statements 2 and 4 cannot be proved, but they can be much truer for the meaningful living of life than any number of so-called factual statements. Brown looked at that question in another way too. He quoted Shakespeare's play As You Like It, where we're told that there are tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, and sermons in stones. The speaker's saying there are valuable lessons to be learned from the woods. The metaphors help to underline the truth of his statement, but the statements are not obviously true as an actual, literal set of facts. They're obviously not true in those terms. And if a fact-minded proofreader got hold of Shakespeare's play, that proofreader might want to set Shakespeare straight. There are trunks in trees, stones in running brooks, and sermons in books. Factually true statements, but not nearly as important. Shakespeare's statement is a valuable description of the woods. The proofreader's statement isn't quite pointless, but I'm not sure it's that important. I want to argue, or at least advocate, for our accepting what science has to tell us in its field of inquiry, but also to make space for religious inquiry. My quarrel is with people who claim that one arena has all the answers, that science can answer the question why as well as how, that The Bible seeks to answer the question, how as well as why. I don't think that's the case. Never been able to believe that was the case. I think we need to keep those questions straight and keep our lives straight in terms of dealing with them. So what I'm saying finally is that God is beyond the realms of reason and science. I don't think God is necessarily antithetical to them, but the two realms cannot be easily reconciled, and they certainly cannot be collapsed into one another. In line with this, I want to say that God is love, with capital L. God is absolute love. And if we believe in that kind of God, a God who is love, who enters our lives from and gives definition to that other dimension of life, then faith's not going to clear up uncertainty. Rather, it's that which makes it possible to live with uncertainty. Intellectual uncertainty, moral ambiguity. We don't have to look for or cling to absolute fact with a white knuckle grip. Winslow Coffin one time said, when you have truth in that regard, there's not much to do with it except bash somebody over the head. I don't think we need to look for or cling to absolute fact with white knuckle grip. We're available for deeper meanings which may come our way. I'll finally conclude this morning by talking about the Christian witness as a specific and particular expression of this other dimension. But before that, I want to deal briefly with the relationship of the two realms and the two realms' relationship to one another. I've tried to say that there are these two dimensions or structures of reality which are apprehended in two different ways. Perhaps that's simplistic, but that's my thesis. I believe further and most importantly that meaning is often located, in fact it's importantly located, in the two dimensions relationship one to another. And thus I point to the I-thou relationship as a genuine one. With Martin Buber, I would say, life does not exist in virtue of activities which only have some fame for their object. Life does not exist in the realm of the it, but in the realm of the thou. With Buber, I would say, when thou is spoken, the speaker has no fame, nothing. The speaker takes his or her stand in relation. In The Hinge of History, Carl Michelson employs historical method and a category of history as a means for doing theology. History, which he understands as both past factuality and our interpretation of that factuality, it's important, is thus not simply objective or simply subjective, but it's both objective and subjective together. Philosophy, science, may be too objective for doing theology. Emotion alone, I think, is too subjective. History is indeed an appropriate instrument for doing theology because it recognizes life as a whole in its itness and its thou-ness, to use Buber's terms. Michelson calls this theology one of correlation, and he thus makes history the foundation for the relation between divine and human concerns. In so doing, he seeks to avoid that Cartesian dichotomy of subject and object and tries to unite the theological and philosophical choices of faith and reason. That's an existentialist approach. It considers the whole of existence. And in keeping with the tenets of it, Michelson asks about the meaning of a faith occurrence rather than inquiring of its factuality. In historical concerns, or in historical terms, his concern is with event rather than the thing. It's about our confronting the thing, the event of our confronting the thing. And I agree with that. Now, I tend to express these sentiments with less esoteric and more earthly illustrations. Tennessee Wesleyan College, where I worked, used to have a football team. Not for long. And some would argue that it wasn't really a football team, but they dressed in pads and such on Saturdays and had a football on the field with them. And during those years, we regularly played Tim's alma mater, Emory and Henry, and without fail were soundly thrashed. In fact, our team was soundly thrashed by practically everyone it played. But once, in 1989, we nearly won a game. And that was against an established program at Kentucky Wesleyan. Now, some of the folks at Tennessee Wesleyan, in the wake of that near victory, and desperate for some semblance of success for our football program, began to think that that game might be a turning point of sorts. I even caught myself speculating and thinking, what if? What if, on the basis of that near victory, our team got inspired and actually won a few games? What if a few victories then generated enthusiasm, not only on the team, but on the campus and in the community? Most people have to pay to go to a football game. We were at the point where we were paying people to come to the football games. It was that bad. And what if that enthusiasm attracted better players and led to more victories in the following years? And what if one day we beat Emory and Henry? Well, that near victory at Kentucky Wesleyan in the fall of 1989 might have one day taken on true significance then. The facts would be the same. Kentucky Wesleyan, 21. Tennessee Wesleyan, 20. But the interpretation of the facts, and a true interpretation of the facts, would give them new meaning. Since, as Michelson said, and I love this quote, a fact is like a sack. It's empty until you fill it with meaning. Well, Tennessee Wesleyan's football team failed to comply with my scenario, struggling to yet another winless season. But the point still holds. There's an element of interpretation to life that adds meaning to life, that's crucial to understanding life and living it to its fullest. In life, loss can and sometimes should be interpreted as near victory, or better still, as a turning point on the road to victory after victory after victory. Love, as we've seen, illustrates this too. Dr. Black's wife may have just been after his money. You cannot prove that another loves you, and yet, as each of us does in any meaningful relationship, we'd stake our lives on the truth of those relationships. The facts can't prove those relationships, and never will. But we'd stake our lives on them. We don't stake our lives on cars, homes, or other objects, regardless of how much we appreciate them. We stake our lives on the subjects of our affection, the thous. And we especially stake our lives on the supreme thou, that is love, with a capital F. If there's to be meaning in our lives, we're forced to interpret things. And finally, we're forced to risk based on our interpretations. We're forced to believe as well as know. Belief is risky in terms of the objective, cold, hard facts, rational, empirical way of thinking. But finally, I would contend, believing is the only meaningful way to live your life. For we do not know so much of that which gives our lives impetus and meaning. At the least, our knowledge of fact is augmented with interpretation, and quite often, our interpretation of events, affections, and life generally transcends fact and demands risk. We do not know so much of that which gives our lives impetus and meaning. We believe it. And this is especially true with respect to faith with a capital F. Again, I'm advocating that holistic or existentialist worldview that asks of the meaning of things in addition to, some would say rather than, their factuality. It thus seeks to do justice to the whole of human life. And I believe this worldview to be tremendously important, if not uniquely appropriate to any life of faith. I utilize it when encouraging others to entertain, if not experience their own lives of faith. It's on that methodological foundation that my theology stands, and in line with it, that I interpret the Bible, understand church history, do Christian ethics, and so forth. How then does one get from that general acknowledgement, which in essence as God is love, to a particular confession of faith? How does one get from a general existential and largely philosophical stance that acknowledges a religious way of thinking to that particular religious way of thinking? That is Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim or Taoist. I'm not sure I've got the answer to that yet, but I'm willing to make a stab at it through another story. Will Campbell is one of my patron saints. He's a Baptist preacher from Mount Juliet, Tennessee. He grew up in Mississippi and was a noted civil rights worker back in the 60s. Later became an author. I had the privilege of taking my students to Will's farm in Mount Juliet on several occasions and visiting with him there after reading his books in our classes at Tennessee Wesleyan. He was always gracious and welcoming, despite his reputation as somewhat of a curmudgeon. He said that a fellow preacher named Thad Garner was the most profane man he ever met. But he said he also was, in a way, the most profound. Well, whatever he was, he made a deep impression on Will, and indirectly, later made a deep impression on me. He was a preacher down the road from where Will preached just out of seminary in Taylor, Louisiana. He'd been there for a long time when Will got to Taylor, and he sort of took Will under his wing. Because Thad was so profane, it was often difficult, if not impossible, to see him as holy. He smoked, and that was forbidden in the Southern Baptist Church in the early 50s. He'd gone to the Holy Land when his congregation gifted him a trip, but he bought the color slides he showed to youth groups when he returned at the Tel Aviv airport. He really did not like teenagers very well, drank a lot of wine, though he only had one kidney and couldn't handle it well, and he cussed a lot. So one day while bird hunting, Campbell asked him, "Thad, why did you ever decide to be a Baptist preacher?" He looked puzzled and not just a little hurt. He pondered the question for a long time, sighting and squinting down the barrel of his shotgun. Finally, he looked Will straight in the eye and he answered the question. "'Cause I was called, you damn fool." Says Campbell, "I met a lot of preachers since then, but not one of them could preach with such assuring certainty, claimed to believe so little, or was as convinced as he was indeed that he was indeed called to do exactly that as Thad Garner." I met a lot of preachers since then, but not one of them could preach with such assuring certainty, claimed to believe so little, or was as convinced that he was indeed called to do exactly that as Thad Garner. Now, at first glance, this looks like rank subjectivism. Emotions run amok, and in both general and particular terms. There is here, it would seem, simply the assumption that that spiritual realm is true, and that it is particularly true in terms of the Christian faith. Thad had jumped into what we call the faith circle with both feet, and he left reason behind, or so it seems. But I think there may be more going on here than that. I would maintain with people like Friedrich Gogarten and Gerhard Ebling that this faith cannot be simply labeled subjectivist. I would maintain that this faith is not simply a person's affirmation of an idea or ideal, but rather it's a person's being confronted from outside by a word with a capital W, a word from beyond, a word that interprets and is then incorporated into a relationship, into a new history, conditioned by the history of Jesus Christ, for example. And that history exists in both fact and interpretation. Faith, therefore, transcends subjectivism by virtue of the fact that it's a historical mode of being, a being from the other and with the other. And apart from that other and historical interaction of the two, there is no genuine faith. What happens in Revelation and faith thus bursts the bonds of the subject-object approach and can't be comprehended by it. To attempt to do so leads to distortion of the genuine reality involved. I'll put it another way. There are three baseball umpires. One is an empiricist, an experientialist. You see it, you hear it, you taste it, you touch it, you smell it. That one asserts when the pitch is thrown. I calls them as I sees them. Well, the second one is much more objective, deeply objective, and he indignantly responds, I calls them as they are. So both turn to the third, each hoping for an endorsement of his own position, only to experience a shock to their more naturalist standpoints. The third says, they ain't nothing till I calls them. Now, to the empiricist and the rationalist, that sounds like a crude subjectivism. But as Michelson was constantly pointing out, such an objection fails to perceive the wide gulf between subjectivism and existentialism. Existentialism holistically includes the self in what is grasped. It doesn't rely simply on the self in complete subjectivism. There was a pitch thrown, a thing happened, but apart from interpretation, it had no meaning. Similarly, the kerygma, the proclamation, is such a thing out there. If there's no independent object toward which the Christian faith is directed, but only the subjective faith of the early church, the believer is set adrift in a sea of subjectivism and relativism. But the objectivity, the objectness of that which is espoused keeps faith from being completely subjective. Something is at the heart of the event. Then the thing gives way to interpretation and faith is born. I think that was the case with Thad Garner. As we used to say at home, something got a hold of him. It got hold of him in a way he could not shake. And he's trying desperately to understand it. In fact, he spent his life trying to understand it. Now, we all know if Thad saw particular therapists, they might not have much truck with or use for that religious dimension. So his interpretation of what happened to him might be attributed to simply being in his head. Maybe he'd had a deprived childhood. He was looking for a means whereby he could gain self-esteem and recognition, and becoming a preacher was a means to those ends well within his grasp. And he could get similar interpretations from a host of other professionals. Was it Marx who said religion is an opiate for gullible people? But that couldn't get over that experience. And he realized that the thing, the object of his turmoil, was forever going to be interpreted. And that his interpretation, I was called, was and is as legitimate as any other interpretation. It's not an objective interpretation of the occurrence. No interpretation is. But it's not completely subjective either. Because there was occurring there, in addition to Thad, this thing that happened to him. And is confronting it thus, we have an event, a real event in Thad's whole existence. We have another reality that Thad has to call as he sees it. Michelson summarized all this extraordinarily well when he said, Christianity comes to the world with the force of a hint. Some get it, some do not. But for those who do, it is the power of God unto salvation. Christianity comes to the world with the force of a hint. Some get it, some don't. But for those who do, it's the power of God unto salvation. I'll stop there and entertain any questions to the extent I can that you might wish to raise them. I could go on to tell another story or two about some of my faith experiences.
Do we have any?
Do you have any questions?
I'd like to hear another story or two. Thank you so much.
Well, another story or two. She said, I'll do that. Yes, ma'am.
Did Mr. Black ever become a Christian?
No, not that I'm aware. Not that I'm aware. He left West Virginia Wesleyan under some difficult circumstances. There was a very conservative element among the student body there that did not, at that time, appreciate his agnosticism. And the college stood behind him, but the turmoil was just so great that eventually, when another job made itself available, he took that job and moved to the Philadelphia area. And I lost track of him after that, although I may be able to find out a little bit more. His son was one of my classmates, and we'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary reunion this October, and I'm hopeful that his son will be there. And if so, I'd love to find out what happened to his dad. Well, another story. My own experience of this. I used to take groups of students to England. We did a Wesley studies tour, and still I've taken folk from local churches as well. Any and all comers were welcome. And one of the things we've done repeatedly when we visited England was to go to London, of course, and to worship at City Road, the Mecca of Methodists there, Wesley's Chapel on City Road. And then in the afternoon, as did Wesley himself, we traveled to St. Paul's. We've often been there, as it happened, on a Sunday when at St. Paul's Cathedral they commemorated Wesley's heartwarming experience and had Methodist choirs from the greater London area in the chancel to provide the music for an afternoon service. And then a wreath was laid at the base of a bust of Wesley that's in St. Paul's churchyard. After whatever happened at St. Paul's, we'd walk up to Aldersgate Street. This one particular year, Tim heard the story the other day. We were out from St. Paul's, and I was trying to explain to them the protocols regarding picture taking and so on. And I noticed a sign across this courtyard that said American style hot dogs. I'm a great hot dog lover, and I hadn't had one in about 3 weeks. So I said, you folks go in and I'll catch up with you. And I went across and bought 3 hot dogs, and I ate them, and I caught up with my students. And at the appropriate time, we headed toward Aldersgate Street, and I had a heartwarming experience myself. I thought I was going to die. I literally had to sit down on the sidewalk. They're all huddled around me. Doc, are you okay? No, I'm not okay. We lied on the sidewalk. It occurred to me then that Wesley might have eaten one of those hot dogs. Because I'm sure they've been there for 200 plus years. And his heartwarming experience might have been nothing more than indigestion. That's the risk we take. But on the other hand, if we've had that experience and we seek to understand it and interpret it, we do so out of our own cultural experiences, just as we interpret the Bible out of our own cultural experiences, our own backgrounds, our own lives. The consequences of Wesley's experience reached the 4 corners of the earth. You know, it said that his funeral was held in the dark of night because there was fear that crowds would be so great if it was held in daylight hours that people would be crushed to death. And it's also said that when John Wesley died, there was scarcely a home in all of England that did not have some likeness of him within its walls. So the consequences of that questionable experience, that risky experience, were great indeed. And I know full well that you can take that experience and go in a lot of different directions. If we had more time and I had another opportunity, I'd go on to talk about Wesley's so-called quadrilaterals: scripture, tradition, experience, and reason, as hedges against our becoming excessively subjective and our discarding reason to the extent that some of our good brothers and sisters seem intent on doing. I think Methodists are in a remarkably good place that way to keep that dialogue going between the realms and to keep that necessary tension between the disciplines. We can certainly tilt too far in one way just as we can tilt too far in the other. But regardless, I think it's going to be a risk. And we have to decide whether we're willing to take that risk. That's the nature of faith in my limited understanding, experience at least.
Question,
Yes.
are you impressed that some of our colleges and universities around the United States are becoming more antipathetic to religion? And what's it gonna be?
Oh, yes, the question is, how do I view the situation in colleges and universities today where there seems to be great antipathy toward religion? I do worry that religion gets a bad rap. I fear that we brought that on ourselves. You know, whenever the media deals with religion, it seems to me they always deal with right-wing Christianity. And I'm thinking, that doesn't apply to me. I'm not an ultra-conservative fundamentalist type. But that's an easy category to latch onto. And it certainly puts in juxtaposition the debate that I've tried to bring closer together. I do have some concerns about directions schools are taking, and sometimes out of necessity. So many liberal arts institutions, from which I graduated, at which I taught, and others too, seem to be finding great difficulty pursuing that historical track, and professional and vocational programs are taking hold. There again, I guess I'd be, as Will Campbell used to call me, your basic optimistic Methodist. He damned me with that phrase, saying you're just your basic optimistic Methodist. I continue to hope that not only religion, but philosophy and other liberal arts disciplines can be a leaven in the loaf. Yes, students go to school in order to equip themselves to get a job, and that's becoming increasingly the case. But without critical thinking skills, I worry that what's being taught now as practical will be obsolete within the next 10 or 12 years. And that we need to go back to some of those basic kinds of skills and disciplines that convey critical thinking skills. Religion among them. And conversely, I've always felt, and this was the problem I had, trying to bring religion into dialogue. I mean, students who took my classes, they thought, I've gone to my local church for the last 18 years, and I know this stuff. And then they'd come to my class, and I'd say things like, there are two creation stories in Genesis, and they don't agree with each other. What? No. But they were reading things through their own grid, and generally it was a fundamentalist grid. And I wasn't. I tried that. It didn't work. We do one of those CSI kinds of things. Okay, let's look at the resurrection site. If they got it right anywhere, that's where they should have gotten it right. Okay? How many people were there? Were they inside the tomb? Were they outside the tomb? Were they standing? Were they sitting? Did they recognize it? Did they not recognize it? The stories, in many instances, are to convey truth, not fact. And so, we have to have a dialogue on that side of the coin too, I think. But I fear that the dialogue's lost. one of the reasons I retired when I did was I just got tired of arguing because in the face of, increasing pressures. And I understood the pressures. When competitors made those decisions for those kinds of programs at the expense of others, because there are only so many hours they can take in a 4-year course, pressure was on us to do likewise. And there were very few schools that had endowments sufficient to withstand that pressure. We certainly didn't. We didn't at all. But I fear that we do students a disservice if we didn't encourage them to think, because I think they'll need that very quickly, given the obsolescence of some of those practical things. And by the same token, if we just let them waltz through without thinking about, I tell my students, now that was fine for Mama and Papa, if that's where you got it, or from your parents, if that's where you got it, but at least have enough commitment to your faith to make it your own. You think about it. Decide where it makes sense and where it doesn't, and whether you can and should reconcile those things, and how so. It's yours. I never had much use for the text of the Living Bible as a translation, but I liked that term because I thought the text should be alive and interpreted again and again and again in a new way, in a new situation, depending on who was reading it when. Yes, ma'am.
What about all this stuff in the elementary schools where they're banning books like To Kill a Mockingbird? They're saying that slavery is good because it gave people skills. And they can't read the real story of what happened in slavery. It just breaks my heart.
Well, it does mine too. I grew up in a home where asking questions was not only encouraged, it was demanded. And I was encouraged to read. My family was not a wealthy family by any means. My mother was the primary wage earner in our family, and she was an elementary school teacher. But there was always money for books, always. And I read To Kill a Mockingbird when I was in 7th grade, and still am grateful for that exposure. I always told my students, God won't break. I don't think they will either. If they're allowed to pursue things. We didn't have the best students at Tennessee Wesleyan. Our test scores and other objective criteria demonstrate that. But I would, and did and still do argue, we had some of the best people in the world there. And they were fully capable of deciding for themselves what they should. Certainly, parents need to give guidance and supervision, but that can be done without saying no, absolutely and finally and for all time. And certainly, in my view at least, that shouldn't be done on behalf of everybody. We used to have a Bible woman who came into the schools in McMinn County, and she taught Bible. Ryan may remember this from his days there. And she was a remarkably fine woman. But she had a completely different take on the Bible than I did. Had I had a child in the schools at that time, I probably would not have wanted her to teach my child the Bible. And I doubt she would have wanted me to teach her child the Bible. But that doesn't mean that the Bible couldn't or shouldn't be taught. It's taught in appropriate context. It's taught in conjunction with traditions and so forth. It's not forced down anyone's throat, but it's not withheld either. There was finally a compromise in McMinn County when the Bible woman could no longer go into the public schools. She was invited to Keith Church to do the Bible lessons for any one who desired them after school. And transportation was provided with, parental approval and guidance. And then the students were picked up after the Bible lessons. There was a huge hue and cry about taking the Bible out of schools, taking the Bible out of schools. But the Bible lessons at Keith Church didn't last very long. Parents then had to come get the kids after the Bible lesson was over. And that apparently was a bigger chore. So, I'm progressive. I'm liberal in those respects. But you can go too far in any direction, I think. So, yes.
If we were planning a visit to Wesley Chapel in London, what advice can you share?
Go a day early to make sure you know how to get there when the time comes. The subway system in London is phenomenally good, but the last time we were there, we happened to coincide with the London Marathon. And many other subway dams, luckily Stella and I had gone on Saturday and determined how we could get there. Make arrangements ahead of time. They're gracious and more than willing to accommodate folks. But there are literally people from all over the world who visit Wesley's Chapel in London. I would encourage that to the nth degree. I've rarely been moved by worship. Of course, I will when I hear Stella preach sitting upstairs, but I've rarely been moved by worship as I've been moved at Wesley's Chapel because of the World Methodist community that's a part of that church normally, but that visits that church too. It's been a remarkably good experience for us. Wesley is buried behind Wesley's Chapel, and there'll be somebody there who will offer to take you to Methodist sites around London following, and he'll do that gratis. Most people want to afford him some compensation for his time and trouble. If you take advantage of that tour, and it's conducted by the same gentleman who's done it when I've gone, be prepared to walk for about 4.5 hours because he takes you everywhere. Susanna, John's mother, is buried across the street from Wesley's Chapel, and generally the cemetery is open on Sundays for visitors who want to visit her grave. His house is there on the property, and it's open. So I would encourage that, but make arrangements ahead of time, and make sure you. That's right. No, those were at St. Paul's completely. Those were Anglican hot dogs. Those were Methodist hot dogs. Yeah. Oh, and certainly visit St. Paul's and the bust of Wesley that's in the churchyard there, and go to Aldersgate Street. Now, there's not much at Aldersgate Street from that time, but there is a plaque in the sidewalk wall, and then up above, near the Museum of Transportation, if memory serves correctly, there's a huge memorial to Wesley's heartwarming experience. The folk are very gracious at Wesley's Chapel. One time we were denied access on the front end. They were doing some filming in commemoration of a huge bicentennial or sesquibicentennial celebration, and said they couldn't accommodate us for the tours and such afterward, but we were welcome to come. Well, I took the students the night before, and I still don't know how I did it, but my colleague William McDonald somehow slipped into the compound there and found out where the pastor, who was also the general superintendent, the equivalent of the bishop of British Methodism, lived, knocked on his door, said, "We were there and we'd like to look around." And he told William that as soon as he finished his supper, he would be happy to accommodate us. And he did. He came out, and he sort of chastised us for not making prior arrangements. Well, many of you would know the person who made the arrangements for that tour, Anna Maynard Lee. who works at Cokesbury, whose dad's Charles Maynard. And if you know Anna Maynard Lee at all, you know she did what she was supposed to do. And our students were quick to jump in and say, well, Anna called you and you said, he didn't know anything about that. But he was very accommodating, and he gave us that tour Saturday evening rather than Sunday after church when he was otherwise occupied. So they are gracious. They are gracious.
Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Roberts, thank you so much for your lecture this morning. What a wonderful way to begin our summer lecture series. If you have attended worship already, you may remain briefly and ask questions. Those of us who do need to go upstairs, we're going to quickly do so. But again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for your great questions. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. You're allowed to come too, but we'll limit the stories. Okay. You can hear stories next week.